Well, that's the problem, and for a country like my own, Australia, or the US, or Japan, or the United Kingdom, there's no question about whether they can afford it, because these governments issue their own currencies, and they can spend as much as they want. They can buy whatever is available for sale in that currency without question. Now, that's not the same thing as they should go crazy with their spending. They should spend so that everybody has a job that wants one. So for countries outside the Eurozone who issue their own currency, there's no question that they can afford it. What limits government spending in those economies is the real resources available to be bought. So, and idle labour is one real resource that can be bought. But for a Eurozone country, one of the problems of the structure of the Eurozone is that when Spain entered the Eurozone, it surrendered its own currency. And by surrendering its own currency, you adopted to use a foreign currency. The euro is a foreign currency to all 19 members. And what that means then is that unlike the United States or Australia, who can make spending whenever it likes, a Eurozone country has to be able to fund its own spending, and it has to either be able to spend its tax revenue, or if it hasn't got sufficient tax revenue to cover its spending, it has to then borrow in the bond markets. And they're the only two options for a country that doesn't have its own currency. And so the question is, how can it afford it? Well, it can only afford it if the bond markets are willing to fund deficits beyond the tax revenue raised. And you've got an additional problem then in the Eurozone. So go back to that point. The problem with Eurozone countries with respect to the bond markets is that, unlike Australia and the US and Japan and UK, Canada, all these countries, who have no credit risk attached to government spending and government borrowing, a Eurozone country can go broke. And so therefore it has credit risk, and therefore the bond markets will see that country in a very different way. It will evaluate that country in a very different way that it will evaluate the United States, for example, or Japan, because the bond markets know that those, Japan and the United States, etc., will never default on its liabilities. It can always afford to pay them. Whereas a country like Spain, the bond markets know that under some circumstances your government can get into trouble and be forced to default on its debt. For example, what we're seeing in Greece this week is more turmoil because of this credit risk. And so the ability to spend in a Eurozone country is limited by how much you can borrow. And on top of that, then, is the rules constraining, even if the bond markets are willing to lend your government's money, you still can't have deficits that might be large enough to satisfy fill the spending gap because of the Stability and Growth Pact rules. And so when you ask me how can a Spanish government afford such a scheme, well, I would say that it's highly likely that it can't afford such a scheme because you don't have your own currency.